telling the whole truth, how SAFCEI can help make a success of COP17. So I'm going to talk perhaps a bit more about the COP and particular approach to it than the details of the work that I've been involved in. But I would be very happy to answer any questions and go into more details of that work. But I'd like to start by saying that I really am very honored to be able to address SAFCEI. And the main reason for that is I've been an admirer of SAFCEI from the outside for quite a long time, I think since its inception. Not only through knowing Jeff and Kate, but also because I think SAFCEI is one of the few organizations that embodies the exact principles that I want to talk about tonight. From my perspective, SAFCEI is an organization which embraces diversity. In other words, it draws its strength from its diversity. It's not something which is merely incidental to its existence. But it is also unified by a common purpose, and that enables the very diverse faith communities to be united in action, which I think is extremely important. And the other thing that impresses me about SAFCEI, and which I think is very, very important for the future, is that the people in SAFCEI are drawing their motivation from a very deep place. That people are coming from deep inner convictions about ethics, about the understanding of the human being and the role of the human in this world, and also with the spiritual understanding of those things. And I think all of these things are going to be extremely important in addressing issues like climate change. And hopefully, as we go on, we'll see what I mean. But before I really get into the meat of what I want to talk about, I thought I would just very briefly remind everyone of the context in which these discussions are happening. Now, I know that all of you are very well aware of the environmental issues in the world today, but I think it's worth just recapping briefly that the Earth at the moment is in a period of critical transformation. And the magnitude of this transformation which the Earth is undergoing, which has already commenced, so it's not something which may happen, it is happening. The magnitude of it is something which our species has never experienced before. So it is completely unprecedented for our species. The climate is changing, the chemical composition of the oceans is changing. We're in the early stages of the 6th period of mass extinction. The last one happened 65 million years ago with the end of the demise of the dinosaurs. Everything is changing. So it's hard, quite frankly, to overestimate the significance of the period that we live in. If we think of events in our country, the biggest event we can probably think of in South Africa is the end of apartheid. Now, the end of apartheid was hugely significant in historical terms. It's significant in the scale of 100 years, maybe even several centuries. But what we're talking about is a transition which is significant on geological timescales, on timescales of millions of years. So it's a very, very significant period we live in. And of course, this should ring some alarm bells. For example, if this is unprecedented in our species history, in other words, human beings have never seen change of this nature, it should suggest to us that precedent, how we've acted in the past, might not be such a good guide for the future. We're going to have to make changes which we've never had to make before. So that's the first point. The second point, which I think is also very significant, is that we are all aware of the many what we call environmental crises in the world today. Climate change is just one example. There's also deforestation, loss of fertile soils, the collapse of fish stocks, the mass extinctions of wild species, loss of fresh water supplies, coral reefs. You can go on and on and on. There are many. But the real issue is that what we are doing to solve these problems, or the environmental crises, isn't working. That's the brutal truth. I've been an environmental lawyer for about 2 decades, and I can tell you that despite the fact that the last probably 3 decades has seen an unprecedented volume of environmental laws in countries throughout the world, environmental treaties, most international law probably, or a great deal of international law now is to do with environmental issues. Despite all of those attempts, if you look at the state of the world's the natural world, it's declining. And in many instances, the rate of decline is accelerating. So 10 years ago, the world set itself, the international community set itself the objective of stopping the accelerating rate of loss of biodiversity, extinction of species. And it failed. If anything, it's happening faster than ever, and the predictions are that it will increase in speed. Now, there was a British politician who was fond of saying that if you're in a hole, the first thing you must do is stop digging. And that's the issue here, because we haven't stopped digging. And that's why we're getting deeper and deeper into the hole. Now, the question, of course, then is, if what we're trying to do to stop these issues isn't working, why not? What have we got wrong? And I think the key issue here is that we have got a faulty diagnosis. In other words, if we can see that our planet is sick, and the human communities and the many natural communities that depend on the health of the planet are also sickening as a result, but we haven't diagnosed the illness properly. And as a result, our responses are not helping. The first reason for that, I think, is that our cosmology, our map of reality, how we understand the world and how we understand the role of the human within that world is inaccurate and faulty. The map we're working from does not correspond very closely to the reality. It's as if we're we try to find our way around a landscape with a very faulty map. And the map that we've got at the moment, and when I say we, I'm talking really about industrialized civilizations, which are now most of the planet. Our map is really an anthropocentric map. In other words, it means we understand that the human is the center of the universe, the center of creation, and everything revolves around us. And it's also, we still have a hangover from the Age of Enlightenment, the 16th and 17th century in Europe, which brought about a mechanistic understanding of the universe. So before that in Europe and in many other cultures throughout the world, the understanding of Earth had been as a bountiful mother. She feeds us, she clothes us, she's fertile, etc. Or some variation of that. But certainly, if you look at indigenous cultures throughout the world, they are characterized by a very strong emphasis on maintaining respectful relations with everything around them. And the world around is not conceived of as objects. It's not, as Thomas Berry used to say, it's not, the world is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. So that is very significant, because if you understand Earth as being like your mother, it immediately tells you something about the quality of the relationship that is appropriate between a human being and nature. Now, as you all know, in the 16th and 17th century in Europe, and this happened in other times in other places in the world, there was a shift, and we began to understand the world in terms of a new model, a mechanistic model. So the universe was understood as like something like a complicated clock. But it was all these little cogs that worked together, and if you took it apart and studied each cog one by one, then you could ultimately work out how the whole machine worked, and you'd be able to drive the machine or operate the machine for human benefit. And so you can see from that model, suddenly the human being is standing outside the world. We're separate from it and we're superior to it. We are looking at this machine. It's a machine. It's made of objects. It's not a being anymore. It's not a mother. It's not sacred. And we're wanting to take it apart, study it so that we can use it for our own benefit. Then, on top of that, we add ideas like more is better. That the way to be fulfilled as a human being is to have more. More money, more possessions, more power, more status. More is better. And that really starts driving human society and development in a rather unpleasant way. But these ideas, unfortunately, became entrenched in our societies. And one of the ways in which they became entrenched was law. Because what law does, we all know that law says, you know, thou shalt not do this, and there's certain things which are prohibited. but law is also used to constitute society. So the first time you get a group of people coming together to form an organization, they make a constitution. We've doing this discussion earlier this evening about the SAFCEI constitution. How are we going to vote? How are power going to be exercised within SAFCEI? That is fundamental to any group of people coming together, whether it be an organization, a tennis club, or a state. And in your constitution, you effectively put what you believe in, and you structure your state and the exercise of power in your society in a way which is based on your understanding of the world. Now, if we go back in history, we know that there were times when some people were defined as property. We call them slaves. Now, a slave was not seen as a person with the rights of a person. They were seen as an object which could be bought and sold. And it's not difficult to see that if the law defines one person as a slave and another person as a slave owner, you will always have an exploitative relationship. The slave owner has all the rights, and they will exploit the rightless slave. Now, that relationship, which the law entrenches between the slave owner and the slave, the law entrenches between our species and the rest of creation. In other words, if you look outside at nature, in the eyes of the law, that is property. Everything in nature is an object which is either possessed by somebody, owned by somebody, or is capable of being owned by somebody. In other words, a wild animal, and if you capture or kill it, then you acquire ownership. So that exploitative relationship is hardwired into our societies, and it becomes part of the way we think, and essentially, even if you don't believe in it, you end up having to act in accordance with that understanding. Now, so if the world really was a machine made up of a whole lot of parts which were inanimate, that had no consciousness, no spirit, no soul, if you will, then that legal system would make a certain amount of sense, because we would just be talking about cogs in the great clock, and it wouldn't really matter if people owned them. But this is where we come now, I think, to the critical issue, because I think that our species has very poor prospects of surviving, or at least most of them surviving, unless we successfully make a transition to an entirely different worldview. And the expression paradigm shift is overused, but it is more or less what we're talking about here. And what I'm wanting to speak about this evening is a shift which is the same magnitude as the shift that happened when Galileo and Copernicus said, you know what, although everybody believes that the sun moves around the earth, our calculations are actually saying that the earth moves around the sun. Now, you can't hold both positions. Either the sun goes around the earth or the earth goes around the sun. You can't be somewhere in between. You have to take your pick. Now, on the one hand, in this scenario, we have a mechanistic understanding of the world, with the human being separate from it and superior to the world. In other words, the world exists for our benefit, it's resources for us to exploit. And on the other hand, we have what I, for the purposes of this talk, refer to as the whole truth. By that I mean that we are part of a whole. The truth is that we are part of a whole, an inextricable part of the whole, in the same way as a cell is part of an organ and the body is part of the body as a whole. So there is no hierarchical distinction in the body. In other words, if we are separate and superior to the earth, you can see the hierarchy. We are above and superior to. In the body, there's functional differentiation. The liver has its job to do, the kidneys have their job to do, etc. But it doesn't. You can argue about whether the liver is more important to the body than the stomach or the heart or whatever. The fact is, you need it all, and each part of the body contributes to the health and well-being of the whole. So, what we human beings are, is we are more accurately an aspect of Earth. We are so intrinsically part of the system that we could be more accurately described as a particular manifestation of this living entity Earth than something entirely separate. So when we think about, for example, human survival, we think, will our species survive? But as thinkers in the past have pointed out, the unit of survival is not the human being. The unit of survival is the human being and their environment. We can't exist without our environment. So you can't separate the two. And that reductionist thinking, the idea that you can separate out the human from the body of which it forms part, is part of our problem. So it's really true, I believe, to say that I am Earth and Earth is me. And religious writers, as you know far better than I, as far as I'm aware, every faith going long way back in history have pointed out the fact that the human being can only be fulfilled within the context, the greater context. In other words, each of us is born to play our role in the whole. We can only be fulfilled as a human being by playing our role in the whole. And this is particularly strong in African philosophies, where it's made very clear that you can only, your humanity, your full humanity, can only unfold through your relationships with others and through your relatedness within the whole. And by others, I'm not only referring to human beings. We talk a lot in this country about Ubuntu and tend to focus on becoming a person through having respectful and right relations with other human beings. But that very same idea, of course, applies to the entire cosmos. Because if you have an exploitative relationship with your water supply, for example, and you foul your water, that will feed back and cause problems. So the real shift then is from the mechanistic understanding based on ourselves being superior to the rest of the world and attempting to achieve human fulfillment through more, versus an understanding of ourselves as being an integral part of this incredibly beautiful universe, and particularly this planet, which is, we haven't found anything remotely approaching it in the entire cosmos. There probably are other amazing worlds, but this is, to be born a creature on this planet is the most incredible privilege that you could dream of. And for us not to embrace that and to understand that the fulfillment of the human can only be achieved through participating and playing our role in fulfilling the whole. In other words, our role is, we need to remember and try and find out what our role is in the whole. Because our role, and the only way I believe to be fully fulfilled as a human being, is to try and play your role, if you like, for the greater glory of the whole. And of course, that's also enlightened self-interest, because if the whole is healthy, if the body is healthy, then the cells and the organs within the body will also be healthy. So it's not just pure altruism. Not that there's anything wrong with altruism. But I've been talking at the moment, perhaps at a fairly abstract level, but to bring this down to climate change and to give you a sense of how different these approaches, how these different understandings play out and why they're important. I was privileged enough to attend the Copenhagen COP17 briefly, and then also after the failure of Copenhagen, the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, called a People's World Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Cochabamba in Bolivia. And I also attended that and was the lead drafter of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which came out of that conference. But what was so interesting is if you look at how the two philosophies play out. So Copenhagen is a bad-tempered wrestling match. It's horse trading, everybody trying to look after their own interests, do deals, etc. The people are shut out, they're beaten back by the police, they have to sit on the freezing streets for hours before they're put in prison, and nothing really happens. There's impasse. Okay? And I believe that part of the problem is because the wrong questions are being asked. So what Copenhagen, what the COP meetings are about, is they're about climate change. And how this is defined in quite technical terms. So it's about how do we reduce emissions of CO2 and greenhouse gases, and it's really about how far can we carry on emitting before everything collapses. So it's about working out exactly how far we can exploit the system before it collapses. That gives you how big the carbon pie is. Then the argument is about who gets the biggest slice of the carbon pie and who gets to, and what's the price and who pays. Now the price is obviously, some of it's financial, but you know, the Maldives get to lose their country. That's the price they get to pay for these things. So the point that I'm wanting to stress here is this is a reductionist approach where we're looking at this one narrow issue of the climate change arising through increases in greenhouse gas emissions, and we're trying to solve it in a very narrow mechanistic way. But if one asks, for example, the very narrow question of how do we reduce emissions of CO2, you might, if you ask that question and you define the problem in that way, you might legitimately get to an answer which says we should use biofuels and we should use nuclear power. Because those are answers to the narrow question. It's only when you look at the wider ramifications for society, for the environment, etc., that you realize that those are the wrong answers. But it depends on how you define the question. And the mistake that we're making is that climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of the problem. It's the same as when somebody is ill and they get a temperature. Their temperature goes up. Now, you can mop their brow and cool them down a little bit, and that helps a little bit. That's addressing the symptom. But the real issue is, why has the person got a temperature? Have they been wounded? Have they got flu? What's the real problem? And that's what you've got to diagnose. And those questions are not being asked in the COP negotiations. Why? What is driving us? Yes, we can see the immediate cause might be this greenhouse gas emissions, but what's driving those greenhouse gas? Why are we doing that? Why are we acting in that way? Why haven't we successfully stopped ourselves when we know it's bad for ourselves? Now, then the contrast we're going to move to. So a lot of the arguments at Copenhagen is, are we going to aim for an average increase of 2 degrees Celsius? Or should it be 1.5, or should it be 2.5, or whatever? Shift now to Cochabamba. Bolivia is the poorest nation in Latin America, and the president says the people were excluded from the discussions in Copenhagen. I'm inviting anybody in the world to come to this conference to have it so that people can discuss the issues. And they expected about 15,000 people, and then there were the volcanic eruptions in Iceland, so nobody could fly out of Europe, and the North Africans and Asians who were flying through Europe couldn't get there. So it was expected that was going to be a real problem, and 35,000 people turned up. Absolutely amazing. People flocked down from the hills all over Latin America, and they queued for hours in the dusty streets to get admitted to these meetings. And there were 17 working groups, each discussing a particular issue. The working group that I was in was discussing a universal declaration of the rights of Mother Earth. And as a lawyer, I always tell people you can't draft by committee. You must come up with your ideas as a committee, and then you must give it to 1 or 2 drafters to go and draft. So we had some drafts of this before we got there, and when we got there, I sort of tentatively suggested that maybe we should get everybody's ideas and then we could draft it. And I was told that's not the Bolivian way. Bolivia is serious participatory democracy. And what that looks like is 400 people in the room, all speaking Spanish. Very, very, very vigorous Spanish. And all going through the text line by line, and people changing. Amazing experience. And people sat there for 5 hours at a time and participated. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, so I had a translator speak in my ear, so I was virtually bleeding from the ear after the first dance. But amazingly passionate stuff, and completely different from Copenhagen. Everybody there was cooperating to try and find the right words to convince the rest of the world about how they saw things. So the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth is, in some ways, can be understood as an indigenous worldview, but it's also the worldview of quantum physics and ecology, i.e. that everything is connected, interconnected, expressed in the legal language in the language of the law that the international community can understand, because that's effectively the language of the international community. So, for example, it said, the understanding is that everything that has come into being has the right to be. In other words, if we claim to have human rights simply because we exist as human beings, even if our government denies them to us, even if the courts deny them to us, we say we still have fundamental human rights because we exist as human beings. If that is true, then that is true of everything that has come into being. So every being has at least the right to be, and a place to be, a habitat or a place to be, and the right to play their role within the whole. So whether that's a mountain or a river or an animal or a forest or a human being, those are the fundamental rights. But one of the most significant things about this is that it's very strange to a Western ear, particularly to a lawyer's ear, to think of a mountain having rights or a river having rights, because we have been brought up certainly in a legal culture which says they can't have rights because they're things. They're like this lectern. It doesn't make sense for this to have rights. So it's very strange for us. But if you say Mother Earth, just that term, or you say the mountain has rights, you immediately are no longer the slave owner dealing with the property, the slave. You are dealing with a being. And with a being you must negotiate. You have to establish a relationship, a two-way relationship. And the only relationships that are sustainable are two-way relationships of benefit. If you have a friend and you only use your friend and they don't benefit, that friendship will end. So we have to re-establish these two-way relationships of benefit. So out of this approach, instead of the arguments being about should we go for an average increase of 2 degrees Celsius and these technical arguments about carbon trading and etc., the discussion is completely different. The discussion is what is best for the health of the planet. Now this is not a mechanistic idea, 2 degrees, it's health, which is a systemic idea. So ultimately people concluded, well, in the long term, in the very long term, we should be aiming at pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the air, because we know that that was the healthy state. But certainly in the short term, we should be aiming for no more than 1.5 degrees average increase, because those are the levels that we know are safe. 2 degrees might be safe, it might not be safe. The scientists will tell you it's I don't know exactly if it's 50-50, but it's probably 60-40. We're by no means sure that that's safe. And of course, the other thing is that it's not spread equally over the globe. So if you go for an average of 2 degrees increase, that means that people on the poles are probably 4 or 5 degrees, and people in Sudan don't live there anymore, and people in the Maldives don't have a country anymore because it's flooded. So there are huge equity issues around that. But the other thing that happens in the Cochabamba approach is that the diagnosis is different. The diagnosis is not that we need to reduce CO2 emissions in the cheapest possible way. The diagnosis is that the fundamental problem is that we're not living in harmony with nature. We are not in right relationship with the other beings that together with us constitute the whole. And that's what we've got to change. And so what do we do now in these situations? Because the COP discussions which are going to come to this city in a few months' time, they are on the mechanistic point of view. They're trying to solve the narrow issues. They don't want to look at why. They don't want to look, because looking at why involves looking at the fundamental nature of the society. It looks at issues like, should we be putting greed and personal accumulation above the survival of our species? It looks at all kinds of very tricky issues for the people who wield power in our societies. I think what we've got to do is we've got to build a movement. And I was just saying that the last time I was in this building was in the 80s, when this was a hotbed of the struggle in the UDF in particular. And so I have very fond memories of this building, although it's moved upmarket to lots of hours last year. But now we've got to build a global movement, because we're talking about a global issue. And of course we will all work locally on our particular issues, but we have to be united globally. And now, I think for a long time one gets very angry, and certainly in the struggle, we want to pull things down. But the system we are facing here is so huge and so powerful that the energy that it will take to pull it down will be immense. I think we forget about pulling it down. I think we just start building the society we want. Let's put our energy into that. Just start doing the society we want to build. There will be conflicts from time to time, but let's just go for what we want. And the question, of course, is what are we trying to do? I think we're trying to live in harmony with nature. But if we unpack that, because even the use of the term nature implies a sort of division between us humans and everything else, at its most fundamental level, it means an internal transformation. How do I, as a creature, a cell if you like in this body, how do I find a way of living my life in a way which contributes to the whole, which makes a positive contribution to the whole? And that's a very difficult thing to do, particularly if you live in an industrialized society. So part of this is an internal transformation. Part of it is, and then as soon as we move beyond the self, we start looking at how we get into right relationship with the world as a whole, nature if we like. But I think that also, in a spiritual sense, amounts to, you could rephrase that as to how do I live in right relationship with my God, or whatever higher power you believe in, because it's all integral. And how are we going to get the power, how are we possibly going to get the power to change the whole world, this huge entrenched system based on personal accumulation, etc.? Well, I think the only way we can do that is by harnessing the powers of nature and of the universe itself. And as far as I can see, and this might be stretching it a bit, and there's certainly most people in the room know more about this than I do, but I think that what our wisdom traditions teach us, and in a funny way, perhaps science as well, is that the force that we're talking about is love. If we look at the universe, it's held together by forces of attraction. They might be gravity, they might be subatomic forces, etc. But everything in the universe has an affinity for everything else. It's what a mentor of mine, Father Thomas Berry, talked about communion. He said that the universe is characterized by a number of principles, one of which is the tendency to diversify, which you see the incredible biodiversity we have. But that tendency is balanced by a tendency for communion, for as the diversification happens, so the interconnection intensifies between the whole, and also by what's sometimes called autopoiesis, the characteristic of the universe to organize itself into self-organizing bits, whether they be cells or bodies, etc. So everything is held together by these forces of attraction. Now, maybe it's pushing it a bit to call it love, but in a human context, that's what we would call it, the intimacy of the relationship. People have referred to that same force between human beings and other species as biophilia, the love of life or other species. We have to tap into those very deep convictions of human beings to drive this movement. This is not a movement that can succeed on the basis of self-aggrandizement, of profit, or anything like that. And I think you'll be getting to see why I'm using SAFCEI as an example of an organization which has the characteristics both of diversity and of united action and of drawing on these deep convictions. And the most exciting thing about this is that it's happening. It's already happening. So for some mysterious reason, I wrote about some of these ideas a long time ago, 2002. It's almost 10 years ago. And nothing happened very much for many years. Then in September 2008, Ecuador adopted a constitution with giving rights to nature. And earlier this year, there was the first successful case upholding the rights of the river. Then there's Copenhagen, the Climate Change Conference, and shortly after that, the Cochabamba Conference in April 2010. Out of that, we get the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which establishes the fundamental rights, but more importantly, establishes the human duties to observe those rights. Now, I think the real significance of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth is it would be wonderful if it's adopted by the United Nations as a companion piece for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to contextualize it. But the real issue is as soon as it starts a discussion, because as soon as you start discussing that document, you're discussing, is it valid to talk about nature having rights? Is it valid to talk about a mountain as a being? And so it opens up a new discussion. Then in September 2010, a group of us who've been working on these ideas throughout the world met in Ecuador and founded a global alliance for the rights of nature, which you can find it on the web. It's www.therightsofnature.org. This is intended to be not really an organization, but it's intended to be a way of facilitating different people and organizations around the world who are interested in these ideas of cooperating with each other. So it's supposed to have the minimal amount of organization, and it's to enable people to find information, to find other people like themselves, and to form their own working groups to take issues of this, like this forward. And and then in April this year, so this is only sort of 2.5 years, the whole process I've described. It was on the agenda of the United Nations, and I was privileged in the 20th of April this year to address the United Nations General Assembly on these issues. So suddenly there is real traction, and it's coming to Durban. And what's going to happen, I think, in Durban is I think that there's going to be a collapse of the middle. I think that I would be delighted to be proved wrong, and that the mainstream negotiations achieve a breakthrough and we get a strong treaty out of it. I think that there are people out there who don't want that to happen and will probably succeed in making sure it doesn't happen. So I think that we're likely to see a collapse of the negotiations in the middle, which may kill the process, because if you have a failure in Copenhagen, Cancun in Mexico, if there's a failure in Durban, people are not going to want to pitch. You're not going to get heads of state to the next meeting very easily. But that represents a very exciting opportunity for civil society, because everybody's then going to be looking at, well, what's the alternative? And the alternative is to, in my view, is to build this global alliance which is based on embracing diversity, united around a few common principles such as are in the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. And the real purpose of it is to say to people that we have to shift our worldview. We've got to move to the whole truth. And I think an organization like SAFCEI, which has these values at its core, it is structured in this way, and the faith communities, which are one of the very, very few organizations in our societies today that regularly speak to people about ethical issues, about what it means to be a human being, and what the roles and responsibilities of the human being are within this greater whole, is going to be incredibly important. The faith communities are going to be incredibly important in spreading that message. So I think that we live in dire times if we look at the statistics of what's happening to the earth, but we also live in incredibly exciting times. For whatever reason, everybody here in this room is living in a period of transition, the likes of which the world has never seen before. And it's within our power to play a major role in that. So it's also an incredibly exciting time. And I'll leave you with that.
With that, I would just want to allocate a few minutes to those who may have burning questions on this presentation before we proceed to the agenda. So I trust that you will.
Yes.
Please, please take it.
What was the response of the UN General Assembly?
Mixed, I think is probably so some countries were very inspiring. Nicaragua says we are already teaching the Universal Declaration in all the schools in our country, and they're really going for it. The response from the European Union was, we all agree that there needs to be a paradigm shift and things need to change and change and change, but the paradigm shift they really want to see is a shift to the green economy. Now, green economy sounds fantastic, and one would generally support that idea, and I do support it within certain parameters, but what they're meaning by the green economy is commoditize everything, put a price on everything, and use the market to sort it out. Now, to me, that sounds like digging. I mean, as in digging a hole, you know. And then the United States delegate was perhaps the most honest and the most brief. So she just got up and she said, we think you should be following official channels. I would have thought the UN General Assembly was a fairly official channel myself, but anyway, and we don't believe there should be any new agreements, and that everything's fine. We just don't. Basically was her message. So, but her mandate was quite clearly from the government to try and close down these discussions. And of course, what the discussions that we are talking about have very radical implications. I mean, we are talking about changing society fundamentally, but I think that that's what being a human being requires us to do in these circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question, do you think that we are going to have a new protocol during the COP17? And also, if you would appreciate, you could summarize just only 3 points, the priorities of the agenda, and then how the local people can be involved. So to emphasize the universal values, as you mentioned, because today they use this argument of the sovereignty they have, of the states, and they unblock the negotiations. So how the local people can be involved?
To be honest, I don't think that the process is capable of delivering what we need. So I would like there to be a strong protocol coming out of it. I think the chances are very, very low. I would be happy to be wrong, and that there would be one. But when I went, I saw the negotiating hall in one of the negotiating halls in Copenhagen, and I don't think I'd really got it until I saw it. There are massive, massive rooms, almost like half of a rugby field, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rows of chairs out there. We're talking, I think it's something like 192 countries of that, somewhere in that order, all of which have to reach agreement, and a lot with very, very different agendas, all horse trading. And you look at that and you think, if I was the CEO of a company that was in big financial trouble, it was about to go bankrupt, and I had to work out a very strong turnaround strategy to get him out of the trouble, and my board of directors looked like that room, what are the chances? None. So I'm afraid I have a very, and also it relates to the point that you raised, the question of sovereignty. The international order was designed for a different world. It was designed for the world of peace treaties to stop wars, where sovereign nations were battling, and it was better to negotiate. And while I'm not saying it has no validity, and we have to work with it because it's what we've got, I don't believe that the system is appropriate for or particularly well designed to deal with issues of huge global concern like this. So, look, I'm a supporter of the United Nations in the sense that I think the world would be a poorer place without it. But I think that that pipe, that channel of change, is blocked, or very nearly blocked. And it's certainly whatever gets through will trickle through, and the agreements will be so watered down that they won't be strong enough. And it reminds me of the arguments that I used to hear in South Africa in the apartheid years. And one of the arguments, particularly in the white community, used to go something like this. Apartheid is established by laws. And that's how it was established, a whole of laws. Laws are made by Parliament. Therefore, in order to get rid of apartheid, you have to get a majority in Parliament that will change the laws. And therefore, you must work within the parliamentary system. Now, there's a certain logic to that. But of course, it was never going to work because the majority of the people in the country weren't allowed to vote. And so the whole game was rigged. The game was rigged. So what happened was that pipe, the parliamentary pipe for bringing about change, was blocked or constricted. So what happened eventually is that the social forces were so strong that it went around it. we had CADESA, we had all these negotiating for a set up specifically for those circumstances, because the existing structure wasn't good enough. And I think that's what's happening at the international level. I don't think we can push through strong enough, decisive enough change through those channels quickly enough. I'd be happy to be wrong, but the good news is we don't have to. It's better to have an international agreement that everybody gets in, but quite frankly, we've had international agreements and people don't comply with them anyway, and we don't achieve it. We don't need anybody's permission. We don't need a treaty to start working on these issues now. We can do that now. We already are doing that now. The real issue is not what's happening in those negotiating rooms. The real issue is how do we re-understand what it means to be a human, so that our society starts seeking to play a positive role within the whole rather than undermining the whole. And that's difficult. But difficult challenges that are extremely important as arise in wartime are very good for innovation and they could be the start of a new renaissance. It's a sufficiently big challenge to humanity.